welcome to the last lesson of this series. And we are on part two of the life of Joseph. And what we're going to end up talking about tonight is everything after the famine starts in the land of Egypt and how Joseph and his brothers are reunited. And then we're going to talk last about the theological theme of the book of Genesis, because the way Genesis ends shows you the whole point of the book. We've covered a lot of ground from Abraham to this point, and I told you that the two most important characters in the book were Abraham and Jacob, and so we're going to see the end of Jacob's life today and how that plays out. But we'll start in chapter 42, and so what we're going to get to is right here. If you would, go ahead and we remember how chapter 41 ended. Read chapter 42, and then we're going to come back and talk about chapter 42. All right, so you've read chapter 42, and we're just going to kind of recap here and look at what was happening up to this point. And so what ends up happening is for 7 years, Egypt stored 20% of its agricultural output. That was what they did under the direction of Joseph, as he managed everything and made storehouses for it. Now, these were really great years. They had a lot of food these years. They were years of plenty. And so Egypt had stored up 140% of agricultural output. And remember, they were a net exporter of grain, meaning they always produced more than they needed. Even in the Roman times, they were feeding the Mediterranean. So they made a lot of grain, and they kept 20% each year for 7 years, storing up 140% of agricultural output in storehouses. Now, during the lean years, there were 7 of them, Egypt used its current produce. So whatever they would have put those years out, and it might have been 10%, might have been 20%, but they used that, and then 140% as a reserve under the direction of Joseph. So Joseph opened up those storehouses, and what ended up happening, as you saw in chapter 42, is that the rest of the world starts looking to Egypt to feed them. And so Joseph's brothers are sitting around, and Jacob, he's had enough of them sitting around, trying to figure the problems out. He says, go down to Egypt, buy us grain. So they head down there, and Joseph, he meets them. And Joseph sees them in verse 7. He recognizes them. But he treats them like strangers and speaks very roughly to them and accuses them of being spies. And so it ends up that they get some grain from him, and they spend money on it, but their money is in their bags when they head back. So they think that they have been they think they've been treated badly somehow, and they make sure that they don't go back. So they get back home. The food is gone after another year, and they're like, we can't go back. Our money was in our bag. But if you look at the story, it ends up being in at the end of the chapter, that Reuben, once again, remember, Reuben is the one who tried to protect Joseph from his brothers. Reuben at the end, because they're going to take Benjamin down there. Last time they did not take Benjamin, the youngest son, Joseph's brother by the same mother. Reuben says, I'm going to put my 2 sons as collateral and protect us all in case anything happens to Benjamin, so that we're going to go back to Egypt. Now, they don't want to do this. Jacob is like, nope, we're not going to do this. I can't lose Benjamin. I've already lost 1 son. So in chapter 43, we have kind of the same start of chapter 42. There's the famine. and it's really bad in Canaan. So once again, they're having some trouble. So I want you to stop and read chapter 43 now. And chapter 43 is going to take you on a bit of a whirlwind. And so go ahead and read chapter 43, and then we'll come back and discuss it. All right. So chapter 43, as you see, is kind of the chapter that shows how everything is played out. Now, they know they've got to bring Benjamin with them this time. And finally, Jacob lets them. And they bring some gifts, and they bring double money, and they go down to Egypt. And it says in verse 16, when Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of the house, bring the men into the house and slaughter an animal, make ready, for the men are to dine with me at noon. The man did as Joseph told him and brought them into Joseph's house. And the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house, and they replied, it's because of the money. They still think that he's tricked them the first time they were there and wants to capture them. And so they think Joseph is trying to hurt them. And on this whole scene, there's kind of, everyone's tense. Everyone's having an awkward conversation. They're trying to give the money back. And in verse 26, when Joseph came home, they brought into the house to him the present that they had with them and bowed down to him to the ground. And he inquired about their welfare and said, is your father well? The old man of whom you spoke, is he still alive? He's checking on his father. They said, your servant, our father, is well. He's still alive. And they bowed their heads, and they prostrated themselves. And he lifted up his eyes, and he saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son. And he said, is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son. Then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber and wept there. Then he washed his face and came out. Controlling himself, he said, serve the food. He sees his brother, Benjamin, there, and he loses control of his emotions. He has to leave the room. I mean, the way this scene reads, you just see the tension in Joseph. He can't stand being apart from his brothers. He can't stand that the relationship has soured, and he wants to be back with his family. And Benjamin ends up getting more food. And then in verse 40 or chapter 44, we see the kind of conclusion of Joseph's dinner with them. So take a break, read chapter 44. Well, now you see how it ends here. Joseph plays a little bit of a trick on them, and in verse 18, Judah tries to stop, the problem. Verse 22, we said to my Lord, the boy cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. Then you said to your servants, unless your younger brother comes down with you, you shall not see my face again. When we went back to your servant, my father, we told him the words of my Lord. When our father said, go again, buy us a little food, we said, we cannot go down. If our youngest brother goes with us, then we will go down. We cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. And so, verse 28, where you have a quote by Jacob, one left me, and I said, surely he's been torn to pieces. I've never seen him since. If you take this one also from me, and harm happens to him, you will bring down my gray hairs and evil to Sheol. So they tell Joseph about how hurt their father is over his missing son that's talking to them. 31, as soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die, and your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant, our father, with sorrow to Sheol. For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy. And my father saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father, if the boy is not with me, I fear to see the evil that would find my father. You know, 3 chapters in to this story, and you've got these brothers, and it's like Joseph has turned the whole situation back on them, where they're the ones trying to take responsibility now for Benjamin. They're the ones who are trying to take responsibility for their father. Um, they're doing good things. I mean, they're not. It seems like their character has changed as they've become dependent on Joseph, not knowing who he is. Um, they aren't trying to rat one brother out and just survive. Go ahead and read chapter 45. I know I have y'all reading a lot. Read chapter 45, and we'll come back and discuss the end of this scene. I know this has been a long scene. So if you've read chapter 45, it starts, then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, make everyone go out from me. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it. The household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. They can't believe who's in front of them. So Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near, and he said, I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. So he just spells it all out to them. And he has such an understanding of how God had used the situation for good that he doesn't come across mad. And I think part of the reason he reveals himself to his brothers is because his brothers have not tried to sell out Benjamin and get out of there like they sold out him. They take responsibility. They don't want to hurt their father. They know how bad Joseph's supposed death hurt their father, and they don't want to do this again with Benjamin. So the brothers, without saying, hey, we're sorry, have really shown that they have changed. They have gotten over their selfishness. And Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. So I'm going to move to the next slide. Here we go. All the regions began to go to Egypt to buy food. So that was every area around the Middle East that could get to Egypt went to them to buy food. Jacob's sons visit to buy grain, and they visit again. As we just saw, and Joseph reveals himself to them. So that's the main storyline here. After this, you have some chapters, and you can read them on your own if you wish. They cover a lot of different information, but they mainly deal with Joseph's whole family moving down to Egypt. Jacob, Israel moving down, meeting his son again. He can't believe he sees him. And Pharaoh allowing them to stay in the land during the whole time of the famines that they're provided for. And, there's this cool scene in chapter 47, verse 7, where Joseph brings in Jacob, his father, and stood him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many are the days of the years of your life? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of my life, the days of my years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of my years of my life, and they have not attained the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning. So there's Jacob saying, I'm an old man, but not as old as my father and grandfather. And so Jacob meets Pharaoh. Joseph has his whole family down there living in Egypt. And then it talks a little bit about how the land of Canaan and the land of Egypt, they all went in and spent all their money, sold all their livestock, and sold their land to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh owned everything. That's how this Pharaoh at least got so powerful. And there's a lot of stories here you can read on your own. I want to talk about the end of the book now. And so if you'll flip over to chapter 50, verse 20, and I know we're covering a lot of ground, but this all gets to the main point of the book. In chapter 50, verse 20, you've got, I'd say, the theological message of the book of Genesis. Now, after this point, Israel has died, and all the sons of Israel and Joseph go back down to Canaan and bury him in his tomb with his father and grandfather. And they go back to Egypt, and the sons are all upset because they said, now that our father's dead, Joseph might throw us into prison or hurt us because of the bad thing we did to him back in the day. So they try to deceive him and say, your father said, make sure you don't hurt your boys or hurt your brothers whenever, I'm dead, because they're good boys and you need to forgive them. And when they tell Joseph that, his response, he's taken aback by this, and he says, verse 19, chapter 50, but Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, or provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. You remember the original promise to Abraham was going to be that through him all nations of the earth would be blessed. Now the book of Genesis ends with all nations of the earth being blessed by Abraham's great grandson, Joseph. Joseph blesses the whole world because he was sold into slavery. And in slavery, God blessed him and kept him from being stuck in a prison, kept him from being executed, and he ends up being, second in command of Egypt. So Egypt is blessed. All the other nations who come to Egypt for food are blessed. The whole world in that area is being blessed because of the offspring of Abraham. So the promise to Abraham is being fulfilled. But look at it on another level too. Joseph is making a statement about faith in God, that even when bad things happen to God's people, God preserves his promise to protect his people. And so Joseph sees himself not only as an instrument of blessing, but as a way that God's promises to Abraham's descendants are kept. He provides for them, not just saving other nations, but saving specifically his own family. So his family sold him, but he saw that through that, God was going to provide and preserve the life of his family. So he has this strong view that God is at work in history. So I said that this is the theological message of the book of Genesis. Number one, Abraham's promise is being fulfilled. Number two, God's keeping his promise to Abraham even when bad stuff happens. But then number three, there's a bigger, remember, Genesis starts with creation, everything's very good, and it falls to pieces very quickly because of human sin. But now we have human sin being kind of reversed. Human sin sells Joseph into slavery, but God uses that sin, God uses it, and he ends up saving lives. So the message of the book of Genesis is not just a promise to Abraham, and it's not just a promise to all the nations, but it's also just showing us how God works. God uses these bad things to make good. Like Romans 8:28 says, God works all things for good for those who love God and are called according to his purposes. It's interesting how the book of Romans is still dealing with this theme, shown to us in the first book of the Bible, that God is working things for good, even when they're not necessarily good things. Even when sinful people act, God is using that to further his promises, to further his plan, and to protect people. So The message of the book of Genesis from one side to the other is, yep, things are pretty bad. The earth used to be good, but now it's not. Used to be a garden, now it's a famine. But don't fear, because God has started fixing it. In fact, he's going to bless every nation through this one family he chose and picked and protected, this family of Abraham. And he's going to bless their descendants immensely. And he's going to bless all the nations of the earth through them. And just to show you how he's going to start doing that, look at this famine. God fixed it. God preserved people by this offspring of Abraham. And so that's the message of the book of Genesis. Now, the bigger biblical message is, remember that word typology or typology we've been using. Joseph acts as a type of Christ because Christ was also treated badly by his countrymen, by his brothers. Christ was treated poorly and sold into a situation or arrested for something he did not do because of the jealousy of the priest and betraying of his disciple, Judas. But through that evil act of betraying Jesus and executing him, God worked good through it and saved the lives of many people. So we see in Joseph kind of like a preview for the full movie in the Gospels, that once again, God will take something wrong done to a person and use it to save many people. So Jesus, as the ultimate seed of Abraham, the offspring of Abraham, the heir of all the promises given to Abraham, does what Joseph did in a little way in a big way in the Gospels. And so you see that the biblical storyline has been kind of hinted at here, that God works by using bad and turning good out of it. And he does that with Joseph, and he'll do that one day with Jesus. And so the message of Genesis echoes out much further than Genesis. This is just kind of, like I said, the previews. This is showing you what's going to happen later in a bigger way. But unlike with Joseph, we know that Joseph was a cocky kid, liked his coat of many colors, and thought his brothers should bow down to him. Whether it was good dreams or, or a little bit of pride thrown in with the good dreams, he wanted to be served, and even his father was upset with him, saying, "We're going to bow down to you." So when Joseph was sold into slavery, yes, it was a wrong, sinful act, but Joseph was a sinner, and he deserved far worse in the court of God's law. So whenever Joseph says, "You meant it for evil, God meant it for good," Joseph did not suffer, we'd say, unfairly. Nothing that happens to us who are sinners really can be called unfair. We don't deserve life, and even that is a gift from God. But when Jesus was betrayed, we have the only unfair act in human history. As one theologian said one time, don't complain and say that life isn't fair. There was only one person who got what he did not deserve, and that's Jesus. He did not deserve betrayal and death, but he got it. Everyone else, we all deserve pretty bad. But because of Jesus getting what he did not deserve, we get what we don't deserve by faith. Believing in Christ, trusting in his death on the cross, we get eternal life and the forgiveness of sin, something we do not deserve. As Joseph's brothers did not deserve food or salvation from famine, so we don't deserve salvation from sin and death and one day heaven, but we get that. So as we see the story of Joseph close here, we look at the story of Jesus. So in verse 22 of chapter 50, Joseph dies in Egypt, and he tells his brothers, "I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." And then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." So Joseph died being 110 years old. They embalmed him. He was put in a coffin in Egypt. We know from the book of Exodus, when the children of Israel left the land of Egypt, they took up the bones of Joseph to take with them to the promised land. And when they did, um, they carried him back to his father's land and put him in a tomb there. We have another picture of what happened to Jesus, but Jesus, of course, because this is just typology and it's kind of the preview, Jesus is much better. In the same way that Joseph's bones did not stay in Egypt, Jesus' body did not stay in the tomb nor in death. As Joseph was carried out by the children of Israel when God released them during the Exodus, so Jesus was released from death. His body was resurrected. He's now the first fruits from the dead, and he reigns in his eternal, immortal body forever as the King of all things. So we look back at Genesis, and it's a great story, but we see the gospel story shining through it, even bigger story. And we look at that and say the real meaning of Genesis, God takes our sin and works out of it our salvation through Jesus Christ. I hope you enjoyed going through the life of Abraham and of Isaac and Jacob and now Joseph. And I hope it taught you a lot of cool stuff about the ancient world, but I hope also we see Jesus through it. I've enjoyed this study. I'm going to think of the next book we can study together as the summer continues and we kind of continue having some distance learning things over the summer. I'm going to keep doing these online First Essentials. Hope you'll keep joining me for that. Leave a comment, or if you have any questions, email it to me or put a comment in the Facebook page. Miss y'all, and I'm praying for y'all, and hope y'all have a wonderful, wonderful day. God bless.